This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, Chris asked me to talk about Greek tragedy and modern thought, and specifically about psychoanalysis. And as we're making claims of primacy here today, following from Fiona, I'm going to make a rather bold claim that it's pretty impossible to understand Greek tragedy today without thinking about psychoanalysis, without thinking about Freud's role in recreating the genre for the 20th century. And Freud famously and problematically said that the Irish were the only people who were impervious to psychoanalysis. And that certainly through their adaptations of Greek tragedy, at least, they weren't impervious to Freud. That's where I'll start. My interest in psychoanalysis emerges in part from something that Fiona hinted at, which is that I'm interested in thinking about what the intellectual and broadly speaking philosophical ideas are that shaped the literary, theatrical and even filmic perceptions of tragedy in the modern period. And I think perhaps the single most influential theorization of tragedy in the modern period was that of Freud. Freud's ideas, which were formulated at the end of the 19th century, look back to a previous philosophical tradition, but also look forward in the 20th century, not just to many philosophical ideas, but also to a very significant theatrical tradition. I think it's very difficult to understand theatre in the 20th century, broadly speaking, without Freud. One could list huge numbers of playwrights who were influenced by Freud in a classical connection. One could think immediately of someone like Eugene O'Neill, whose Morning Comes Electra is a direct engagement with Freud's ideas. But not just playwrights, but also directors and filmmakers. I think, it would be very difficult to write a history of cinema, a history of theatre, or any of these genres without acknowledging that Freud really changed the terms of engagement for these media in the 20th century. Freud, therefore, has a much massively broad intellectual influence on culture in general, but obviously he has a more local and specific influence on the reception of ancient drama. And this emerges largely because of his famous formulation of the Oedipus complex and its association with Sophocles. And I think this more narrow idea of the influence of Freud on theatre is pretty difficult to dispute, in the sense that I think it has become almost impossible today to stage an Oedipus without dealing with the question of Freud. And this was certainly true of the recent Frank McGuinness production of Sophocles that was put on at the National in 2008. And in this production, not only was there one of two essays in the programme was dedicated to Freud. So there's one on Sophocles, one on Freud. One can't do Oedipus without the pairing of these two figures. There were a number of talks associated with the production which dealt with Freud, but I think it left some impact to some extent even on the performance, particularly the interaction between Oedipus and Jocasta. Some influence. I don't think it was a resolutely Freudian production, and in that sense it begs the question, why did they feel the need to include Freud in the programme, or to have Freud as part of the armature for understanding this text? But but I think, if one wanted to find Freud, one could, but I don't think it was the singular explanatory framework. But it certainly gives a sense of the extent to which Freud is a sort of natural reference point. How do we make sense of this? I mean, if on the one hand I'm saying, when the National decided to stage an Irish production of Oedipus, they felt a need to deal with the question of Freud. If on the one hand there's that sort of necessity, on the other hand there's a scholarly tradition which has largely denied the importance of Freud in understanding tragedy. Certainly in the latter half of the 20th century there's been a lot of scholarship within classics which has attempted to precisely move away from, to deny the importance of Freud, not just from Greek scholars, but also in the broader intellectual context, lots and lots of figures who have set themselves precisely up against the Freudian reading. So if there's a contested situation where on the one hand you have people who completely deny Freud, on the other hand you have a sense of the necessity of dealing with Freud. And I think one way of making sense of that sort of schizophrenic perspective is to think about how Freud fits into a broader tradition, to think about where Freud was coming from and what the reference to Freud brings with it, in a sense, what he brought into the 20th century. And one of the things that I think he did bring with it was the tradition that Fiona hinted towards, which is the much broader Germanic reading of tragedy which dominated the 19th century. Freud was very much a product of that cultural and intellectual background. He was educated in a gymnasium where the curriculum was completely dominated by Greek. He, in addition to that, had a particular obsession with Greek antiquity, and particularly with its cultural artifacts. If you go to the Freud Museum in London, you'll see that they've not only got Freud's famous couch, but they've also, Freud moved to London at the end of his life when he was exiled from Vienna, and he went to extraordinary efforts to bring not only his couch, but much more importantly, we have letters that testify to this, his collection of antiquities. So he left Vienna in extremely difficult circumstances after the annexation, and as a Jew he had to leave Vienna, but most of his energies at times seem to have been dedicated to ensuring that his artifacts could come with him, and they've reconstructed. This image is actually from Vienna, actually, but if you his consulting room in Vienna, but they've reconstructed this in his Hampstead consulting room. So there's a Freud emerges from a much broader current of German Hellenism, a culture in which, in order to understand the nature or the idea of humanity, one needed to make reference to classical antiquity in one form or another. So there's a sense in which the classical reference for Freud was unavoidable. But there is a specificity to Freud's reading which I think it is worth thinking about. Freud comes up with his famous reading, and most famous reading of Oedipus in his interpretation of dreams, so his first major work of psychoanalysis, written at the very start of the 20th century, in 1899, but published in 1900. And it's within the context of a discussion of dreams that he first starts to talk about Oedipus. And this is the well-known passage that people generally turn to, where he writes, if the Oedipus rest is capable of moving a modern reader or playgoer no less powerfully than it moved the contemporary Greeks, the only possible explanation is the effect of Greek tragedy does not depend on the conflict between fate and human will. And we'll see some of the terms from Pantelis' text emerging here. But upon the peculiar nature of the material by which this conflict is revealed, there must be a voice within us which is prepared to acknowledge the compelling power of the fate in Oedipus, and there actually is a motive in the story of King Oedipus which explains the verdict of this inner voice. This fate moves us only because it might have been our own, because the oracle laid upon us before our birth the very curse which rested upon him. It may be that we're all destined to direct our first sexual impulses towards our mothers and our first impulses of hatred and violence towards our fathers. Our dreams convince us that we were. King Oedipus, who slew his father Elias and wedded his mother Jocasta, is nothing more or less than a wish fulfillment, the fulfillment of the wish of our childhood. So in this passage, Freud says something about the way in which Oedipus speaks to us today. The premise of the argument for Freud is the idea that Oedipus is capable of moving a modern reader in much the same way as it moved the Greeks. And he thinks we can't understand this continuity of preoccupation through a conflict between fate and human will, some of the terms which we've been talking about today. But he thinks that it has to be, we have to look somewhere else. It's not about this idea of the conflict between fate and human will. It's in the nature of the story itself which speaks to some inner voice within us. So he talks about a universal appeal within the story of Oedipus which arrests us today in the present. In some ways, he's not, in this respect, he's not so far from Aristotle, who also thinks that the Oedipus, there's something very specific about the Oedipus, which is constructed, as he says, in such a way that even without seeing it, anyone who hears the events which occur shudders and feels pity at what happens. This is how someone would react when hearing the plot of the Oedipus. So this is within the context of Aristotle talking about how certain plots should be constructed. But for him, the Oedipus, the nature of the Oedipus story elicits a response which seems to be universal too, just as Freud seems to suggest. And I think it's certainly the case that Freud was massively influenced by Aristotle. In general, he first called psychoanalysis the cathartic method, but specifically in his reading of Oedipus, he clearly goes back to Aristotle for understanding some of these terms, which is potentially, if Pantelis is to be followed, why he doesn't follow the idea of fate and human destiny. So there are precedents to Freud's, if you like, Freud's sense of the compelling nature of Oedipus in antiquity. There's also, for Freud, if you think about what he was saying about the importance of wish fulfillment and the discussion here of dreams, for Freud, obviously, it's fantastically helpful to him that we have an account of a dream in the Oedipus trance himself, and this passage where Jocasta talks about the prevalence of dreams about sleeping with one's mother in antiquity was obviously fantastically fortuitous discovery for Freud in terms of trying to make his argument. I mean, he would put it the other way around. This is clearly the passage to which he would go to. But I'm interested. I think this was significant. I think the zoning in on this question of dreams for Freud was extremely important to his broader ideas about psychoanalysis generally. But I think there was something in the Oedipus that a broader interest in the Oedipus, which has less to do with this specific account of wish fulfillment and the discussion of incest and parricide, and much more to do with the question of knowledge and self-knowledge. And this is where I think Freud speaks to as I say, a much longer philosophical engagement with Greek tragedy. I think we can get a clue to this, if not in the passages that we've seen here, then perhaps in the iconography of Oedipus that Freud surrounded himself with. Freud had lots of images of Oedipus amongst the other ancient images that he has, and ancient figurines that he has in his office. He had several other images of Oedipus which surrounded him. So we've got a reproduction of Athenian Hydria with Oedipus in his encounter with the Sphinx. Here he had other black figure vases, but the image that is most associated with Freud in relation to Oedipus is the picture by Anne of an early neoclassical image of Oedipus in his encounter with the Sphinx. This image was so important to Freud that it hung over his couch, but he also reproduced it as a book plate, as we can see here, and it was given. So the encounter between Oedipus and the Sphinx was given to Freud on a medallion, which was commissioned by his students for his 50th birthday. And in fact, the bookplate is a reproduction of that. But it was the image of Anne which lay behind all of these later versions. And I think what we can surmise from this is that the image with which Freud imagined Oedipus was not the Oedipus of incest with whom we usually associate him, was not the Oedipus of sexual desire, but the Oedipus in his encounter with the Sphinx, the Oedipus as a figure of knowledge, and a figure who uses his knowledge to overcome the dark forces of the Sphinx. And I think it's all the more striking that not only is Freud surrounding himself with this moment in the story in which Oedipus appears as not, as I say, as a victim of his kind of irrational desires, but as someone fully in command of his reason. It's not just surprising that is the moment in the story that Freud concentrates on. I think it's surprising that he captures that in this very neoclassical image in which in which Oedipus is presented really as a figure of enlightenment, a figure of the progress of human reason and its ability to overcome forces here of the feminine, one might say, of the Oriental, and all sorts of other associations. And the annex picture is very, much located within a historical context where Oedipus was emerging as a figure of enlightenment, but specifically a kind of philosophical enlightenment, a figure of human, of the power of human reason. And I think this interest in Oedipus is not just something that we can pick up in the sort of, in sort of para phenomena in terms of the things that the iconography with which Freud surrounded himself, but also very much in his interest in the play of Sophocles itself. Sophocles' play, as we know, is littered by the vocabulary of knowledge, by the vocabulary of the ironies of knowledge and self-knowledge. That's why Oedipus starts off the play by addressing his audience as his children, right? And Techna, the whole construction of Sophocles' play is formulated around the ironies of the problems of self-knowledge and the contrast between the idea of Oedipus, which we see in the final chorus quoted here, the Oedipus who knew the famous riddles and was a man most mighty on the one hand, so the Oedipus who knows, and here who knew, in fact, because it's in the past, the Oedipus who knew, and the Oedipus who ends up not knowing who he is at the end of the play. And so I think, as I say, I think Freud's interest in the play was driven by, as I say, not just the content of sexual content and the content of rivalrous and murderous desires, but also by this ongoing interest in the question of reason and the question of knowledge and self-knowledge. And I should be wrapping up, but there's a way in which this ties in to the performance history of Oedipus too. We know, people like Fiona and others, that Freud had a strong interest in the theatrical, not just the artistic and philosophical background to Oedipus, but also in the theatrical performances of Oedipus at his time. And that's why at the beginning of his quotation, he talks very much about the experience of being a playgoer. When he claims, not just here but elsewhere in his writing, that he knows that the Oedipus Rex is capable of moving a modern playgoer no less powerfully than it moved the contemporary Greeks, because he actually experienced this within the theatre himself. And people believe that one of the productions that he saw, just as he was formulating his ideas of the Oedipus complex, was the landmark Mini production in Paris at the end of the 19th century, when Freud was in Paris in the 1880s. He's said, although it is disputed, to have seen Mini production of the Oedipus, where we have the precursor to the Beckettian scream in the groans of Mini as Oedipus, and the idea that Mini writes about, that the Oedipus is, if you can have a look in this final lines, He also talks about this idea of the Oedipus as being some sort of conflict with destiny, but he ends up by saying Oedipus represents the revolt of instinct and intelligence against blind fate and man's final defeat. And here, Miriam talks both of instinct and intelligence, and sees them very much as being two elements in Oedipus. Freud will obviously be putting more emphasis on the instinctual than the intellectual, but what I hope to have shown is that through his interest in questions of knowledge and reason, Freud was created a vision of Greek tragedy stuck precisely between these questions of instinct and intelligence, which continued to influence the understanding of Greek tragedy both in intellectual terms but also in theatrical terms throughout the 20th century.